Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so we're going to move right forward for panel number 2, and Ramona Nicholas is going to do the introductions. I just want to do a quick introduction to Ramona. Ramona has a master's in archaeology right from the University of New Brunswick, and she's from the Nunavut, Tobic First Nation, and she's also a sun dancer, a moon dancer, and she's a grandmother, which of course is protection of the land. And in saying that, there is a fundraiser happening. I don't presently have one right now. It's a birch bark heart. They are selling them for $20 each, and that is, of course, a fundraiser to assist the grandmothers for supplies. Sorry, Terry has them right there. The Terry's in the back. Thank you, Terry. Willie and Terry. And so any of you that are interested in supporting the grandmothers, then certainly you can purchase one of those birch bark hearts. Great idea. So without further ado, please welcome Ramona Nicholas.
So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ramona Nicholas, but also Nil Dali was adjusted aluk, Debazumpakal wazited Nagigug, Otse Lotsen Naga Miklan Sewat. So I have a lot of names, just as Imelda does, lots of ceremonies. So I just wanted to say that it's an honor to be here today and to introduce the speakers. The first one that I'm going to introduce is Adrian Downey. Adrian Downey is a PhD student at the University of New Brunswick and has recently finished his Master of Arts in Education focused in curriculum studies at Mount St. Vincent University. He is a member of the Halapu First Nation, a writer, a poet, and a musician. Before returning to graduate school, he was a music teacher in the Cree School Board in northern Quebec. His research interests are around white privilege, identity, Indigenous education, social change, and indigeneity. He can also be reached at, and it's Adrian Downey at msv.ca. And our second participant on the panel is Meaghan Williams. Meaghan Williams is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto. Her research focuses on treaty and federal politics, asking what the theory of treaty federalism implies for institutions of shared rule and political representation. This is her second year presenting at the University of New Brunswick's Peace and Friendship Treaty Days. She can be reached at Meaghan Williams. Yeah. So you'll present first? Okay, and Adrian will present first. Thank you.
Before I start, I have to present my elder with tobacco. Okay. Koi. Waligaskok. Madaw lioktiok? Anyone? Okay. Deluesi Adrian Downey, and I need to thank you so much for welcoming me to this beautiful, unceded and unpurchased, surrendered Wolastoqey territory. It's such an honor to be here, really. I like to start these things with my language, always, and I've recently added a third reason as to why. The first two I borrowed from Jaime Baptiste, some of you may know him, and I think he got them from Alex Denny. So the first one is because my skin is so pale, if I didn't speak Mi'kmaq, you might not believe that I was. It's supposed to be a joke, you can laugh. The second reason is a bit more serious, and I thank Jaime for reminding me this all the time, that speaking our language is a symbol of ongoing resistance to colonial oppression. It's a reminder that after 500 years of colonization, we're still here. We still have our language. We still have our culture. We're not going anywhere. The third reason that I've recently added is that it's an opportunity for me to practice, which I rarely get. So if anybody feels like they want to correct my pronunciation afterwards, I welcome that, please. A little bit more about me. I don't really need to repeat much because it was in the introduction. I'm a PhD student here at University of New Brunswick, and I talk fast. So if you need me to slow down, just go ahead. Normally, my research is arts-based, and I do a lot around identity and the intersection I see within myself between white privilege and Indigenous identity. But today, I'm very fortunate to be able to talk about my people, the Halapu. So yeah, let's get into that. This is basically what I'm going to cover today. Talawakan, the Mi'kmaq word meaning what are you going to do? What are you doing? So I'll start with a brief explanation of what I'm going to talk about. I'll then go into the history of Tahumkuk Mi'kmaq. Tahumkuk is the Mi'kmaq word for Newfoundland. It means over the waves or over the sea. Then I'll focus in on the moment of Confederation in Newfoundland and how that crystallized a lot of the erasure of Indigenous identity that was happening in Tahumkuk pre-Confederation. And then I'll talk about the repercussions and finally focus in, I don't know if anybody's heard about this, but there was this membership review with the Halapu Band where a lot of us are losing our status and things like that. So I'll focus in on that as an example of the ways in which Confederation and the erasure of Indigenous identity on the west coast of Newfoundland kind of manifests itself today. And then if I have time, I'll conclude with a story from my uncle Jerome, who I emailed about this presentation before, just to get it straight, you know. So, Dadawakan, what are you doing? My goal today is to highlight the continuity within our history as Tahumkuk Mi'kmaq between the original erasure of our Indigenous identity through these historical factors into the crystallization of that erasure in Confederation and the legalistic erasure of our Indigenous identities, and then into modern day, where despite having recognition, we're still fighting the federal government for recognition of our Indigenous identities, which were erased by them previously. Now, so this is my goal. I have to add several caveats to that, several statements of positionality, I guess. Part of this is I'm going to lose my status. I am a status Indian right now, but within the next year, I'm going to lose my status. That moves me from being an insider in my community to an outsider to a certain degree. And no matter how much I wrestle with it, that's true. And so I wrestle with my ability to even speak about this. Is it even my place anymore? To talk about our history, to talk about my people, and I do believe they are my people, but is it my place? I don't know, but I'm working through that as we speak, so I welcome conversation about that. Furthermore, as I was telling Meaghan before, I feel a little bit out of place here because it's very poli-sci heavy all of a sudden, and that's not my background, so I'm an amateur here in talking about these things. So if anybody disagrees with what I say, please, I'm here to learn as well. It's been a day of great learning for me. Pam this morning really had me fired up, so I gotta. So I want to start with the history of Tahumkuk Mi'kmaq, the history of my people. And there's this myth. It always starts with a myth, right? It starts with a story. But this is not our story. This is the story that was enforced upon us. And there are two parts to this. And Jerry Wetzel in his Masters of Law thesis from Dalhousie has written about this and really disrupted those narratives. But this is the dominant narrative. Number one, the Mi'kmaq are not indigenous to Newfoundland. Number two, they were brought from Nova Scotia to Newfoundland in order to help the French kill the Beothuk. Neither of those myths are true, but they were both taught in Newfoundland history textbooks from 1950 until the mid-1970s. My own father experienced these myths in his education and many others. So these myths, they permeate collective consciousness in Newfoundland. They're not true. The fact of the matter is, going in reverse order, the English killed the Beothuk, by and large, in large numbers, exterminated them. The Mi'kmaq had nothing to do with it. The French had nothing to do with it. The English created that myth as a lie to smudge the names of Mi'kmaq people and to cover their own butts, essentially. The first myth, that we were not indigenous to Newfoundland, is also not true. The fact of the matter is, Mi'kmaq people have existed in Tahamkook pre-contact on a manner consistent with Natoklamuk, the idea of like our migratory subsistence cycle. Tahamkook was an extension of Unamaki territory of Cape Breton. So when stocks of caribou or some other resource were low in Cape Breton, the Mi'kmaq people would cross the Cabot Strait into Tahamkook and into the Magdalen Islands, and they would hunt in these areas. And this is protected by our oral tradition, where we have, like the families that have, and the Tuklamuk is the Mi'kmaq word, but hunting areas, I guess, in Unamake also have them in Tahamkook and the Magdalen Islands. So we've been there forever. And coming to what Pam talked about this morning about sovereignty and what the discussion has largely been about, that is our claim to sovereignty. The fact that we have used this land. These myths try to remove us from our land. And even in the designation as the Halapu as a landless band, which I'll talk about a bit later, they're always trying to remove us from our land. But it's not the case. Our oral history goes back to the land, and we know that we've always existed there. Having said that, it's very hard to prove permanent settlement of Tahamkook until 1660, 1760, 1780. So there was a major migration after the Acadian expulsion of Mi'kmaq from Unamaki territory to Tahamkook. And my ancestors came in that wave of migration. From that time, that would have been when my ancestors came in 1760, 1780, from Eskasone First Nation, specifically my family, to Tahamkook, the western coast. What was experienced was a less violent form of assimilation, but a still very effective form of assimilation, shall we say. And that has 5 manifestations and factors. They're kind of interrelated. You can't really separate them. So I'll go through them very briefly. But basically, intermarriage, problematic term, I know, but intermarriage was happening before we made that migration to Tahamkook, but because the communities were no longer so isolated, they were very close, the French communities and the English, eventually the English communities and the Mi'kmaq communities. The intermarriage happened a lot more frequently, and it was a lot more difficult to distinguish like that. The legalistic changing of surname has been well documented, that we changed our traditional Mi'kmaq names into French and English names, like Leblanc, and in my case, my mother's maiden name, Benoit, Bennett. The Catholic Church, which I would never say anything bad about because my grandfather would roll over in his grave, but there's an undeniable colonizing presence there. No, that's all I say. The myths I already talked about led into a very negative stigma that I'll talk a bit more about. People didn't want to be seen as Mi'kmaq because it was risky. It was dangerous in that time to be seen as different, let alone as Mi'kmaq or Indian, or to speak out on behalf of your people. It was, and it was made that way probably by the Catholic Church. Later on, in the 19th, early 20th century, what you see is a replaceal of linguistic groups with this nationalistic Newfoundland identity. So first it was the Mi'kmaq, the French, and the English. Then it became the Anglican, Protestant, and Catholic. Then in, let's call it 18 blah to 19 blah, you get this rise of the nationalistic Newfoundland identity, right? I'm a Newfoundlander boy. I don't know what you're talking about, right? That's the way my family sees themselves, largely, as Newfoundlanders, not as Mi'kmaq. Sometimes as Jackie-tar is the term that's, it's derogatory, but that's what we're called sometimes. But primarily as Newfoundlanders. So the rise of this nationalistic Newfoundland identity kind of put aside our indigenous identities, our French identities, like that. So this is just a map to show the territory because some people might not be familiar. If I point, no? Okay, here you go. So in around here, this is our tradition. This is where my family would have landed from Unamaki territory. This Placentia is the first permanent settlement in 1660. And here, some might be familiar, and I'll talk about it later, the Conn River Band is located right here. Our territory traditionally stretches from around here all the way down like this, and this coast here is reserved, or is traditional Beothic territory. So, yeah, the more you know. So at the moment of Confederation, what you had were what I call sleeping Indigenous identities, like some people in the crowd are sleeping now. They were... it was not safe to be an Indigenous person. There was no quote-unquote advantage to it, so people kind of just hid everything away. And my grandfather is a perfect example of this because I remember he would tell stories and no one would listen. It was pushed aside, right? Like, oh, we don't want to talk about that. We don't want to talk about that, right? And I think that goes back many generations. What you also had at Confederation were, so again, the 5 factors I just listed kind of are consolidating in Confederation, right? And a big factor in that was poverty. West Coast Newfoundland, always been poor, right? But especially at that moment of Confederation, like Newfoundland was in dire straits. They needed Canada in a big way. Of course, Confederation happened in 49. There was no consultation when Newfoundland eventually did decide. So it just didn't happen in 49, right? Like that wasn't a thing that the government was talking about yet. Wetzel has a great article about the miscommunications between the federal and the provincial government about who was going to be responsible for the Indigenous people in Newfoundland. And basically what it boils down to is there was a lot of miscommunication. And nobody was really willing to step up and take responsibility for that. Now, sympathetic historians and some people, Wetzel again has talked about this in his master's thesis, but have said that Smallwood's justification for not pursuing the Indian Act when Newfoundland joined Confederation in 49 was that it would have led to Indigenous disenfranchisement. In other words, because Indigenous people only got the vote in 1960, Smallwood's justification, quote unquote, was that he wanted all Newfoundlanders to have a vote, and he protected that vote through not pursuing the Indian Act. Now, if you ask me, that's a load of patooey. He was probably influenced by those colonial narratives that there weren't any Indigenous people in Newfoundland. This is still a prominent idea that there aren't any Indigenous people in Newfoundland. It's simply not true. So anyway, that's the moment of Confederation. And what happens from that is that the Indian Act was not enacted in Newfoundland. Technically, legalistically, I think it applied. I have to do my research on that. But it was not enacted. It was not enforced. And so what that constitutes, in my mind anyway, is the legalistic erasure of our Indigenous identities. All those things that were quietly happening before, pushing our identities aside, result in the legalistic erasure of our identities. We had nothing now. We had not even a leg to stand on, so to speak, within the Canadian legal system. So what that results in is a long battle for recognition within our communities. And I have the dates up there. So the Conn River Band in '84 was the first band to win. In '84, they became status Indians, about 800 of them. 2 years later, they won their land claim in '86, which established Conn River as the first Indigenous reserve in Newfoundland. The Innu fought all the way up until 2002, and then my band, or my group, the Halapu, after, so FNI, Federation of Newfoundland Indians, included Conn River, but they went their separate way to do their land claim. After they got their land claim, the remaining FNI bands sued the federal government because we weren't getting anywhere with the traditional legal systems to eventually form the Halapu Band. So that's the way that came about. Just to come back for a moment to that idea of stigma. So these 2 points at the bottom are about after Confederation, the way Indigenous people in Newfoundland thought of themselves, right? So, for example, some Mi'kmaq in Conn River thought of themselves as Mi'kmaq, but not as Indians. They didn't want to be registered as Indians because they had such a bad stigma about what that meant. So, and it's these colonial myths, it's this intermarriage, it's all these factors coming down to this. And then, so across the river from Conn River into St. Albans, they distrusted the government so much that they didn't want anything to do with that conversation, right? When the government agents said, okay, do you want to be registered as Indians? They were like, no, of course not, because you're going to take our land. You're going to do all these bad things to us. We're just Newfoundlanders. So, having said that, I want to focus in my remaining time on my situation and the situation with the Halapu. So as I mentioned, in 2008, the Halapu was founded, and what happened there was FNI originally had about 7,000 members. Federation of Newfoundland Indians, 7,000 members, 7,000 Mi'kmaq. That's what the federal government had in their mind. The Halapu opened up the registration process, and suddenly they had 22,000 founding members, plus an additional, let's call it 30,000 applicants. The federal government, Harper at the time, right, remember, who Chief Bellegarde has, Grand Chief Bellegarde has talked about it, the relationship as being needlessly oppositional. I really like that. I think it's a polite way of saying, you know, you really screwed us. But so they're negotiating with Harper, and he says, whoa, there's way too many Indians in Newfoundland. That's not the numbers we had in mind. So they established this supplemental agreement. Now, the point I want to make about the supplemental agreement is, A, it was never ratified by a vote of the Mi'kmaq people. B, it was we were never, the Halapu themselves, the people who had gained status originally, were never consulted. It was through FNI leadership, a board of about 13 people, and the Department of Indian Affairs. That's where the agreement comes from, right? Has nothing to do, like it was, the Mi'kmaq people were never asked about that supplemental agreement. But what that supplemental agreement establishes is a membership review. Basically, everybody applied to the Halapu First Nation, including people who had gotten status like me through this, have to go through another process of reapplying. And the results of that are kind of a disappointment. So what happened was, of the 100,000 applicants, so 100,000 people with roots, Mi'kmaq ancestry on the west coast of Newfoundland, many of them rejected. Of the 22,000 original founding members, of which I am a member, my mom, I have my entire maternal family, 10,000, over 10,000 of us are having our status cards taken away. Of the other 80,000 applicants, 68,000 of them say, no status for you, no recognition for you, you're not an Indian, you're not Indigenous. Now the one kind of, you can see it as a positive or a negative, I guess, is that 95% of these people are in Newfoundland, which is what we want, right? We want strong communities. 5% are elsewhere. But the thing I want to emphasize about this membership review is that it's a colonial process, a colonial divisive process, A, and B, it's completely arbitrary. It makes no sense. So my mom, for example, has lived on a different reserve, but has lived on reserve most of her life, works on reserve, speaks probably more of the language than any of her brothers or sisters, but because she doesn't live in Newfoundland, and because she proved her travel back and forth and her communication, but because she doesn't live in Newfoundland, they're not going to give her the points. It's a point system, really, like how ridiculous. They're not going to give her the points for living in Newfoundland, so she's not, she doesn't qualify. Me, because my mom lost it, obviously I lost it, and my sister as well. But my uncle and my aunt, this is where it gets really weird, and you really have to start to scratch your head. So my uncle and my aunt have lived together in the same house since they were born. No. My aunt is a single woman, professional, and my uncle had a nervous breakdown at a certain point, and she has taken care of him since forever. So they're two adults in their 50s and 60s, respectively, who have lived together in the same house, occupied the same territory, done all the same cultural practices, lived in the same community. For all intents and purposes, they're the same person legalistically. My uncle lost his status and my aunt maintains hers. I really don't understand how that's possible. And I'm waiting for the federal government to come and explain it to me. So, in conclusion, we can't escape our past, apparently. It keeps coming back to bite us. These colonial myths, the erasure of Indigenous identity that happened on the west coast of Cook is continuing today through our battles. Originally, when I wrote this, I said that we're engaged in modern treaty negotiations. I don't know if that's true anymore. I think what we need to do is assert our sovereignty. After hearing Pam speak, I think what we need to do is walk away from this deal. I think that's what our leadership should have done in the first place, is walked away from this deal. But maybe I'm taking too many liberties, and maybe my chief is going to come and slap me on the wrist for saying that later. I don't know. But yeah, that's all I have to say. I've said no, come on, all my relations.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Next, we have Meaghan Williams, and hers is called Not Then, So Now What? How Pre-Confederation Treaties Inform Post-Confederation Indigenous Political Representation in Canada. Welcome back, Meaghan.
Thank you for once again inviting me back to unceded Wolastoqey territory. It's a pleasure to be back for the second year in a row. In an interesting way, I'm kind of going back to what the last panel discussed, so I hope you bear with me as I raise some of the same issues, same questions again. There can be no doubt that the Act of Confederation is among the most defining political moments in the history of this territory that we now call Canada. But the unification of the country is defined as much by its exclusivity as by its inclusivity. For many, the legacy of the sesquicentennial of the British North America Act is a reminder that Canada was not built by and for everyone who lives here. For many, Confederation does not mark the beginning of something significant, it marks the end. Or, as I hope to suggest today, it marks a pause. A pause in the treaty legacy that governed relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities prior to Confederation. One way in which Canada can perhaps move forward from a history of exclusion of First Nations is to rewind and to stop centering its colonial institutions and refocus on the pre-Confederation treaties that informed relations between our peoples 3 centuries ago. It's my contention that these early treaties, which include the peace and friendship treaties, reveal a great deal about how Canada might better function today as a multinational and multi-sovereign state. I'm most interested in how this might be accomplished within the realm of political representation, how the early treaties recommended that the various nations represent themselves to one another, and the contemporary legislative institutions that we might derive from these 18th century arrangements. So what I'll do with the remainder of my time is trace my reading of the conceptualization of political representation, first in its Eurocentric forms, and then by way of 2 pre-Confederation treaties. I'll then use these findings, these things that I discuss, to briefly explore the institutions for guaranteed representation in the legislature that might align with or support treaty-based conceptualizations of political representation. So what do we mean when we talk about the concept of representation? Many contemporary political theorists turn to the work of Hannah Pitkin, who in 1967 traced the concept itself through the history of Western political thought. She defines representation as literally representation, a making present again, or, to quote her, the making present in some sense of something which is nevertheless not present literally or in fact. It's from this definition that we derive the association of political representation with what is called the politics of presence. This presence, however, can take a multitude of forms. Descriptive representation, symbolic representation, representation as acting for someone, and the very popular Burkean dichotomy of the delegate and trustee representation. Now, more recently, democratic theorists have turned to Pitkin's analysis in order to better consider the ways in which representation takes on new meaning in an age of increased intra-state diversity, diversity that occurs within the state itself. The question of representation is increasingly one of group political presence within democratic governing bodies. But this work continues to be highly Eurocentric in nature. In fact, theories of political representation in the field of political science have yet to consider indigeneity in any significant way. A variety of approaches could be taken to so-called indigenize the literature on political presence, and perhaps the most necessary is for indigenous theorists to directly engage this body of work and supplement understandings of the concept of representation with those that have informed indigenous political structures for centuries and continue to do so. Another option is to consider the concept of representation through the lens of existing theories such as that of treaty federalism. So as a non-Indigenous person myself, this is an avenue of thought that I'm interested in. The treaties are not by and for Indigenous peoples alone, and because we are all treaty people, I have an obligation to uphold the treaties and consider how they may be implemented faithfully today within my government, within my forms of government. Now, while some work has been done to examine the representative institutions that might derive from particular treaties in Canada, this work has largely focused on post-Confederation and in particular the numbered treaties, and I'm thinking of the work of Kira Ladner here. The conceptualization of representation from a treaty perspective that predates Confederation, that dates back to the early colonial era, has largely gone unexplored. As a result, my work analyzes two pre-Confederation treaties. It analyzes a lot more, but for the purposes of this presentation, it analyzes two pre-Confederation treaties with regard to their conceptualization of political representation. The 1725 Treaty of Peace and Friendship, and I'll also discuss the 1764 Treaty of Niagara. The 1725 treaty is one of the first treaties entered into between an Indigenous population and the British colonial authorities anywhere in the territory that we now consider Canada. It's a cornerstone to the treaty relations that followed after, and this is despite its confinement to the several so-called tribes listed on the eastern Atlantic coast. Now, the Treaty of Niagara that followed about 40 years later involves First Nations from the Canadian interior, and it has become the fulcrum around which most of the conversation about pre-Confederation treaties revolves. And this is due to its significance in ratifying the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which gets a lot more time in discussion than the treaty itself. And we have to remember that the Royal Proclamation of 1763 wasn't considered ratified until the Treaty of Niagara occurred 1 year later in 1764. And this is all significant because it affirms the sovereignty of this entire territory's Indigenous peoples. So I would like to note that, as I said, there are a lot more pre-Confederation treaties. There are hundreds. And the entire collection of these pre-Confederation treaties can actually be used to trace the evolution of the notion of representation in Indigenous political thought. Early treaties, for example, make little use of the term representative at all, whereas later treaties, such as that of the 1760 Peace and Friendship Treaty, actually use the term representative to describe and define who has the right to negotiate the treaties on behalf of the First Nations involved. Now, this speaks to an awareness on the part of both sides, both First Nations and the British colonial authorities, that not every individual had the authority or legitimacy to negotiate a treaty between the two nations. In this way, actually, it's interesting, both the Indigenous and British nations share an understanding regarding representation that acknowledges limits on who and what an authoritative representative is. The fact that these early pre-Confederation treaties are considered legitimate today further confirms this view. First Nations parties continue to uphold the stipulations of these agreements, which inherently recognizes the legitimacy of the representatives who negotiated the agreements over 200 years ago. By contrast, it's now the Canadian state who faces a crisis of legitimate representation as it continues to debate the extent to which it has to adhere to treaties negotiated by British colonial authorities. The notion of the representative as an individual or agent acting on behalf of their community is one way in which we can understand the Indigenous idea of representation as actually overlapping with Eurocentric approaches to political representation. A close examination of the early treaties, such as that of 1725, suggests a dichotomy, the dichotomy of an independence mandate divide, in which representatives function either as trustees or as delegates. Now, in the case of the 1725 treaty, the document speaks only in terms of delegates of the so-called Indian tribes. Now, as delegates, these individuals were acknowledged to work on behalf of their communities and had the power to enter into binding agreements. Within the context of, again, this Burkean trustee-delegate dichotomy, a delegate has significantly less autonomy than a trustee. Delegates are expected to operate in accordance with the mandate that they have been afforded by their constituents. This suggests to us that the negotiated treaties were ratified by a mandate from not the individual himself, but the community as a whole. This is a stark difference from the trustee-style rule that was typical of colonial and now actually Canadian political representation. Now, this interpretation likely explains why the pre-Confederation treaties continue to be perceived by First Nations as legitimate foundations for political relations between the nations and the Crown today. The power of the treaty federal idea is therefore linked to the sense of legitimacy inherent in treaties themselves, as negotiated and ratified in this so-called delegatory fashion. So while the Treaty of 1725 sheds light on, some light at least, on the role of individual representatives acting on behalf of Indigenous communities, we can now look to the Treaty of Niagara in 1764 for information regarding what representation looks like on a macro scale, such as between nations. The treaty, instead of relying on the written word, used Indigenous diplomacy and traditions, including the exchange of wampum, to ratify the Royal Proclamation. The most significant wampum that was exchanged at this time was the Covenant Chain of Friendship, which was made of silver, which had inherent in it the meaning that it required constant polishing in order to stay bright. This suggests that an ongoing relationship is required between the party nations and that the constant polishing speaks to the need for institutions within which these nations represent themselves to one another. Echoing Pitkin's analysis of symbolic representation, the wampum belt depicts pictorially this ongoing relationship, and it also points ideationally to the need for an institution within which substantive representation actually takes place, within which nations talk to each other. What we learn from this reading of the Treaty of Niagara is that Indigenous political representation contains both symbolic gestures, such as the exchange of wampum, as well as substantive mechanisms by which relationships are maintained and reforged in perpetuity. Only institutions that serve both of these purposes are likely to be amenable to Indigenous theories of political presence. But what do we do with what we've just learned about Indigenous conceptualizations of political representation? What kinds of institutions might derive from this theoretical work? A number of models have been attempted in jurisdictions outside of Canada which hold some promise. They include the parallel parliament model that's been instituted in the Nordic countries for the Sami. There's also the reserved seat model, which is used in New Zealand for the Maori, as well as in Maine at the state level legislature in Maine. Now, other models have been proposed from within Canada by way of the treaty federal framework, including the development of a third legislative chamber, the treaty delegate model, and the establishment of a treaty council. Now, what each of these three models share is their organization under a larger third order model of federal government, and I know I'm bringing this back to third order, and we just had a conversation about how we don't like that term, but under a technical definition, they fall under a third order federal government model. Now, this model would recognize Indigenous nations as distinct and co-equal with the two existing orders of federal government in Canada. Now, for the purposes of this presentation, I want to discuss this homegrown third order federal model again, but I'm happy to answer questions about the other ones, and I am happy to answer questions about why it's called third order federal without meaning that it's somehow lesser than the other two. Okay, there's logic behind that. Treaty Federalists have suggested several different institutions that might encompass these facets of Indigenous political representation within treaty-respecting legislative bodies. Among the recommendations are a so-called House of First Peoples, which could function as a third chamber of parliament, guaranteed representation for treaty delegates in existing legislative bodies, which kind of echoes the reserve seat model that we might find in New Zealand and Maine, and this third Queen's Treaty Council, with the authority to implement treaties in a meaningful fashion and monitor progress on their implementation. Now, what all of these institutions share, what all of these proposed institutions share, is a commitment to the three facets of representation particular to the treaties as I've explored it above. They include both symbolic and substantive components, and the members of these institutions are conceived as delegates rather than as trustees. To date, none of the three of these ideas has been fully hashed out by treaty federalism scholars, and there's no indication in the literature on a popular or scholastic consensus on which institution, if any of these, might be viable within the Canadian context. However, what these suggestions demonstrate is a commitment to expressing the particular principles of political representation rooted in pre-Confederation treaties in a larger legislative body that operates on par with Canada's existing federal legislative architecture. It's worth remarking, however, on the significant constraints in the work that I've just presented here. Primarily, the treaties were, as we know, written in English, and therefore, arguably, they offer only a one-sided perspective on the realities of political representation in Indigenous communities at the time. We know that treaties are more than what is written. They also include the oral histories that recount the promises made, and they include the spirit and intent behind each document. That's a significant constraint on what I've just presented, and it's one which can only be fully understood by supplementing what I've just discussed with a thorough investigation into the languages, histories, and political structures, political cultures even, of the specific Indigenous nations that were party to each of the treaties. So that is the next step of my work. It's currently underway, and because it's currently underway, I can't present on it yet. No final findings. However, maybe next year. Nevertheless, I would like to suggest that the written treaties do constitute one source, among others, but one source of information regarding conceptualizations of Indigenous political representation, and suggest at least some ways in which First Nations communities in the colonial era conceived of their presence in the multinational political realm that was emerging. Furthermore, we can still interpret treaties according to Michael Ash's idea that a valid treaty must be the product of a meeting of the minds to a sufficient degree that the parties have a shared understanding of the agreement reached. Consequently, the information that we derive from a textual analysis of the treaties can help us understand the kind of representative roles and institutions that might align with the distinctive conceptualizations embedded within and advanced by Indigenous parties to early treaties. Confederation in 1867 and the Canada that has followed in the 150 years since has been largely unconcerned with the treaties that laid the foundation for this country. If Canadian federalism is to adequately meet the challenges of the next 150 years, it's imperative that we bring back into the center these foundational treaties, especially when considering institutions within which a genuine nation-to-nation relationship is pursued and maintained. Thank you.
So, question. All right, so we have time for questions. Alan will bring the mic around, so if anybody has any questions.
Thank you for your presentations. My question goes to Adrian. Being Meaghan myself, I don't understand why when you refer to yourself, you need to refer to yourself as Halibu Mi'kmaq rather than just Mi'kmaq. And my second question was, why do the Halibu peoples want to be registered with the Mi'kmaq peoples on the mainland of Nova Scotia? Like, if you have a registry number already, why do you want to give that registry number up to join a mainland Mi'kmaq community?
Those are really good questions. In terms of my own identification, it kind of varies moment to moment how I identify. I usually go with Halapu Mi'kmaq because it's more specific and it gives a sense, right? Like the way we would traditionally introduce ourselves is through our grandparents' name. I'm in a foreign territory and most people aren't going to know my grandparents, but they might know the Halapu and they might, through that, know me a bit more. So that's one way of accommodating that. Now, I'm not 100% sure of all the specifics around trying to register with the mainland, but there's been a tense relationship there. I am the first one to recognize that. And people in Newfoundland have not always been respectful, I think, of the work that's been done on the mainland. There's so many of these like Johnny-come-latelys to it that just are in it for the money. It gives us a bad name, right? It gives the authenticity, some of us, a bad name. No, it's not even a lot of money. But it's, so I think it's important to distinguish between it's such a complicated thing to comment on without being offensive to someone, but yeah, so maybe I just...
I'm going to do a Pam Palmeter.
Sorry?
I'm going to do a Pam Palmeter.
Sure.
Just say it. It's okay.
Yeah, I think I have to be careful because if this is recording, then it's going out, and I don't want to be like held accountable for what I do. But there are a lot of people that I think we're financially trying to take advantage of that. But in that, I think a lot of us, people who really feel an authentic connection to our culture and our heritage, got washed in with that and gave us a bad name amongst the greater Mi'kmaq community. There are real Mi'kmaq people in the Halapu, and I don't think the supplemental agreement and the membership review got it right. I don't. I think the arbitrary system they came up with further divided us. So what I think we need now is unity within the Mi'kmaq community, the greater Mi'kmaq community, and especially within the status and non-status Halapu. The people who really feel the connection are the ones that are going to stay and fight it out. That's what I hope. That's my biggest. I hope that.
Thank you.
I have a question back here, Terry.
This is for Adrian. Can you explain why your community is trying to get in the Indian Act when the rest of us are trying to get out? Like, it's an oppressive legislation that's meant to destroy our people, and, you know, it just amazes me when I hear people trying to get in it.
Because we were never in it. We don't have anything else to go with. That's kind of, no, again, I think, I really wish this wasn't on the record. But I wish, it's my deepest hope that the Halapu Mi'kmaq community, we have a lot of learning to do because our identities were erased so much, because our, we've been colonized, like really, through intermarriage and all these things that I listed, we've been colonized very violently in our psyches. It's internal. And we're in the process now of reclaiming our culture and our heritage and asserting ourselves and learning. It's a learning process. I think the Halapu are all in a process of learning. And it's my deepest hope that that Halapu community can come together and learn from the people who have gone before. And like I said, Maybe we just do need to walk away from this whole agreement. Maybe that's the answer.
Stand on your sovereignty.
Yeah. And we do have a very strong claim to the sovereignty of Newfoundland under 63, the Royal Proclamation. So maybe we should go with that. I don't, I'm not the legal expert.
Any other questions?
Any more questions?
I'd be interested in hearing about that third order and why that's okay. The other.
Yeah. Okay. So it's kind of okay, so technical, it's a little bit technical, but what the literature on federalism recognizes two different things, and we heard in the last session they were also mentioned, federations versus confederations, right? There's a difference there in the terminology. A confederation is, I'm sure it's actually an idea very much rooted within the Indigenous tradition of equal partners coming together at the same time, each one being able to choose the terms of its participation and to leave without penalty at any point, right? You can dissolve a confederacy, you can leave a confederacy if you so choose. A federation's a different being, so the fact that we refer to Canadian Confederation is actually a misnomer. We're not a confederation in any way, we are a federation. The term confederation refers only to that specific historical moment in 1867. We are actually a federation, and federations are composed of what are called orders of government. In the Canadian case, we have the federal order and the provincial order. They're actually not, neither one is subservient to the other. It would be a mistake to think for any reason that the provincial government is answerable or accountable to the federal government or vice versa. They're just not. They are two separate orders of government, each equal with the other. That's written right into the Constitution. They have their own areas of jurisdiction, and they have to work together in areas where their jurisdiction overlaps. That is our Constitution. That is the Canadian Constitution. So when we talk about a third order of federal government, we're not talking about a lower order, right? We're talking about a third party to the federal order. Now, it is different from a confederacy in which you have an organization that could choose to come and go on its own, and that could be a problem for some nations, First Nations in particular, who might want to maintain a certain level of independence, right? However, I personally see a way around this. In the Canadian Constitution as it currently exists, we have a federal order and a provincial order. And they have their jurisdictions divided between them, but we have something called residual powers, okay? In Canada, everything that's not defined in the Constitution as belonging to either the province or the feds gets automatically put to the feds. The feds have control over everything that the Constitution was written in 1867. They didn't envision technology, right, in the way that we have it now, or industry even to the same extent. So anything that's not written in 1867 and isn't written in stone in the Constitution falls under what's called residual powers, and the federal government has responsibility for it. Okay. If we were to think about genuinely respecting the treaties, what we know about treaties is that the treaties didn't stipulate everything. They only wrote down what was agreed upon. What was not agreed upon was left out deliberately, right? So that each nation could maintain its sovereignty over those areas where there was dispute about how to manage maybe manage a resource, manage, it depends on the treaty. Whatever it is that couldn't be agreed upon was left out. It's almost like it was a residual power. So if we have a constitution that fully recognizes and actually operationalizes the treaties, then I think it has to recognize a third federal order, which is not to say a lesser one, simply a third party to the Canadian Federation. And the way to get around being seen as a lesser order would be to give the residual power on everything not defined by the treaties to the Indigenous nations. That's it just means everything that's not defined. So whatever's not written in the treaty, all of the leftover things, basically the things that weren't agreed upon, right? Or the things that weren't foreseen because the treaties were written in the 1700s, right? If there was nothing written as an agreement at that particular time, say like language protection. Language protection isn't really written explicitly in any treaty, right? But it's something that matters. Does it not make sense for that as a residual power to fall automatically to be controlled by First Nations themselves, right? So that's the idea that I was thinking. When you talk about third federal order, we're not, one, I wanted to clarify, it's not a lesser order, it's simply a third party to the federal arrangement. And then I wanted to say that one way to get around thinking or even opening a door to it being a control by the federal government is to leave everything, all of the residual powers of the treaties to Indigenous.
So the other things that aren't in treaties,
Yes.
is entirely the Indigenous perspective. There's all kinds of ways we preserve that. So in the prairies, for example, with the numbered treaties,
Yeah.
we have, there were 10 sticks that went with some of the treaties, and the 10 sticks were the sticks that represented the teachings and the agreements that went with those sticks. Those are not written either, and so on the model that you propose, is that residual? Because we actually have some small wins in the Supreme Court that say those are just as important components of treaty as the written.
Right. And so, yeah, and okay, so yes, there are tricky components to this because treaties are not explicitly what is written, right? They are spirit and intent, and there are recognized components of the treaties which are not written but that still form part of the treaty themselves. So what my inclination would be to say, and I'm sure it would be disputed by the Supreme Court, but it's what I'm going to say anyways, is that treaties include everything that is agreed upon in writing or by oral history, or by wampum, by sticks, right? By whatever, as I said in my presentation, representation includes symbolic as well as substantive components. We can't just get rid of the symbolic components because they're a little difficult to a little difficult for white people to wrap their minds around, right? Like they still form a part of the treaty. And so my inclination would be to say that there are nevertheless things that are agreed upon as treaty that go back to spirit and intent, or that go back to wampum, or that go back to whatever else it might be, that weren't specifically written, but that are still agreed upon, right? That aren't explicitly written. And I get that that's a tricky thing to navigate, and it would be on a treaty-to-treaty basis, right? That you have to go back to those things, but I would still nevertheless say that residual powers would only be those things that can't be agreed upon between the two nations.
Do we have another question? Okay.
Just following up on that point. You're proposing, if I'm hearing you correctly, this other order of governance in treaty federalism.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, why is it that, well, maybe strategically is to put the question to the feds about that. But my limited thinking is that already exists by virtue of the treaties.
Yeah.
We're just not mentioning the third order, but it's already embedded in the Constitution,
Right.
as well as the treaty. So we're actually talking about a protocol that's already existing. And an example of that is the treaty at Niagara, when the wampum, one of the wampums that were presented was the two-row. And that was clearly understood that we were dealing with nations to nations. So I guess I'm suggesting that according to treaty federalism, it already exists.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. I think it already does. I think,
Unceded territories is another example of residual powers.
and so I should perhaps qualify my work by saying its audience is not Indigenous peoples. Its audience is the federal government. The audience is the provincial government. It's not Indigenous peoples that need to recognize their sovereignty or third order status or anything like this. It's the government. And I think part of what my work is trying to do is make the case, and it's been made by others, and I'm just adding a voice to the chorus, saying this already exists. This is not an area for dispute. What the area is that needs to be explored further is how do we institutionalize it, right? We've talked today about, there's a lot of theoretical conversation here. Maybe we need to start talking institutions. My work talks institutions. I need to set a theoretical foundation to do that, and that's where I make this case for, okay, we need to recognize third order status and this kind of thing. If we really are going to implement the Constitution meaningfully, then this already exists. That is exactly what, to be honest, my dissertation says. The very next step, however, is now what do we do with it? How do we act on it? Because at this point, there aren't any institutions that allow for meaningful nation-to-nation conversation at the national level between all three orders of government. It doesn't exist yet, but it has to.
Well, that might be a segue into suggesting that while we're waiting for the feds to do this, we have all this time for the citizens of Canada and for First Nations to do it, to actually implement it ourselves.
And so that's why, to be honest, why I focused on legislative institutions. When we think about Parliament, when we think at the provincial or the federal level, we think about citizens directly involved in governance, right? That's what elections are for. But you can also write to your MPP, you can write to your MP, you can influence decisions by way of one branch only, and it is the legislative branch. So that's where I'm most interested in, because that is the way in which, that is the area in which we see citizens being able to directly affect outcomes on governance and how the country is governed. That's partially idealistic, but that's an avenue that I think holds promise for seeing things change by allowing the public. If we see things change in the public, then we'll see things change in government.
As neighbors.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, we get any more questions? Okay, I think we have a presentation. Thank you very much. That was great.
Thank you very much, Adrian and Meaghan, for your presentation. Thank you for your ideas and your thoughts, and thank you for being here.
No, thank you.
Appreciate it.